Hey guys, welcome back. So now, with continuing our talks on the death of Doctor Strange, I wanted to take a minute and get into one of the tie-ins where we get a look at the list of requests that Doctor Strange had made that he wanted Spider-Man to handle at the time of his death. And so for this one, since we've been talking Doctor Strange up to this point, we definitely got to catch up on some Spider-Man for like the first 5 minutes before we really get into this. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so before we get into this one, we gotta talk about Peter Parker's current situation, because he's had a lot going on lately, but in the recent run of Amazing Spider-Man, about around issues 74, things have taken quite the crazy turn. But before I even get into that, first we gotta go back a little bit further and start with the collapse of Parker Industries, back when Otto Octavius had tried to take back the company which he created, leaving Peter at the time with no choice but to destroy it, alongside with his own public image. And Peter's used to bad press, as we know, when it comes to Spider-Man, but this time around with the world just hating Peter Parker, like this hit different for him. But from there, with Peter using what was left from the funds of Parker Industries to cut settlement checks to all the employees that had worked there by literally liquidating everything that he had so that he could give them something. Because regardless of him killing this company to keep it from Superior Octopus, these employees had still lost their jobs in the blink of an eye. But with Peter doing all this, Parker Industries was effectively worthless, which had then led to sometime later the Beyond Corporation purchasing Parker Industries for pennies on the dollar. But also with doing this, Parker Industries had also owned the rights to Spider-Man. So naturally, with the Beyond Corporation buying Parker Industries, they had also acquired the trademark for Spider-Man. But also with doing this, the Beyond Corporation had taken it upon themselves to bring in Ben Reilly as the new Spider-Man, which really wouldn't be the first time we've seen a version of this. But with Ben being offered this position, he didn't say no. And with him taking the quote-unquote job to be Spider-Man, this time he was getting paid. But after accepting, he had then went to Peter, and he was more or less like, hey, we can make this work, we both can be Spider-Man. But Peter wasn't fond of the idea of sharing the name. But for Ben, even though he was hesitant at first, at this point his mind's made up, and regardless to how Peter responded, Ben was going to continue to be Spider-Man for the Beyond Corporation anyway, because they put millions of dollars into making this happen and putting all sorts of technology into the new suit. And even if Ben had said no, they would have just found somebody else and made them Spider-Man later on down the line. But as it turned out, Ben Reilly, who's physically your one-to-one Spider-Man, he clearly was their first choice. And so after this, with us effectively having two Spider-Man, not long after, the Empire State University had then been attacked by the UFOs. We had talked about quite a bit recently on the Immortal Hulk playlist as far as the UFOs' history and their origin, with them getting their powers by trying to be the next Fantastic Four, to where pretty much the UFOs are like when you ask your parents for the Fantastic Four and they're like, no, we got Fantastic Four at home. Like, that's pretty much what the UFOs would be. But with this attack happening and Ben getting there first, because the Beyond Corporation, they pretty much just monitor the city and they tell Ben where he needs to go and he just gets there, versus Peter, who finds out just when he finds out, to where then he just drops what he's doing, like in this case where he was just getting ready to tell MJ about the new situation with Ben, and then boom, in the middle of that talk, Peter had to go make his way out to Empire State University. But with the UFOs losing this fight and needing a huge diversion to get away, vapor creates a radio-volatile gas, which X-ray then detonates, and with doing so, it leaves Peter critically injured, with this explosion giving off massive amounts of radiation. But in the case of Ben, he was protected by his brand new fancy high-tech suit, unlike Peter, who was just wearing his regular costume, which gave him no protection from the blast or the radiation. And I'll admit, like with this happening, I really wish that Peter still had that Mark IV spider armor suit, which Peter made like towards the latter days of Parker Industries, and he had also paid the Prowler to use for a while, just to kind of keep the bad guys guessing, with them seeing Spider-Man save the day as well as Peter Parker running the company at the same time. Because on one hand, I think if Peter still had that suit, it would have helped. But then again, with how quickly Superior Octopus had just destroyed that suit, it then has me thinking like, well, okay, well maybe it wouldn't. But I'm just saying, had he been wearing this suit underneath an armored suit this time, he probably would have been okay. But also, while Peter's in the hospital, there's a conversation between him and Ben that I also want to bring up, because they kind of have this heart-to-heart for a moment, and it's pretty significant for what's to come for the foreseeable future. Because while Ben is here, they revisit the conversation about Ben becoming the new Spider-Man for the Beyond Corporation, because really anytime that Ben steps in, Peter feels like he's sharing his life. And I imagine that's not easier with watching Ben die numerous times, so I can imagine where Peter's coming from wanting there to be a separation. But the thing that's huge here is that Peter, he's very considerate for Ben. And in this moment where Peter gives Ben his blessing to step in the role of Spider-Man again, it's almost like he's appealing to the side of Ben that also has Peter's memories, to where as a result, he kind of needs to be Spider-Man. And when Peter gives this blessing, it really feels like a moment to where Peter's like, okay, go ahead, Ben, be Spider-Man again. But use this to kind of go forward and find yourself, because you deserve to be happy. And on top of that, we kind of need a Spider-Man out there in Peter's place, at least until he's better. So he gives Ben his blessing, he tells him to go out there, be Spider-Man, be amazing, which is also like that confirmation that Ben didn't ask for, but you can tell that he needed it. But this is what sets the current stage for Ben Reilly stepping into the role of Spider-Man, which also may be a bit longer than expected, because also not long after Ben had left, Peter's condition had gotten worse and he'd slipped into a coma, which is what sets the stage at this point for the Death of Doctor Strange tie-in, to where sometime later we see Felicia Hardy visiting Peter, and she kind of feels bad because this is the reward that Peter gets for being the hero and saving the day, which is just a hospital bed that he can't afford and he might not get out of. But while Felicia's here, Ben pops up to check on Peter, and she doesn't waste any time going off on Ben, telling him that this is what he wanted, when really she's just going off because she's hurt about the condition of Peter, and she's just taking that out on Ben right now. But we'll dig more into that in just a little bit, because I do want to get a bit more into the history between Ben and Felicia a little bit later, but we'll get to that. But in the middle of Felicia going off, the Doctor Strange talking head pops up, because it's here where a message for Peter Parker from Doctor Strange was set up by Doctor Strange, because he knew that Peter was someone he could trust to make sure that a specific list of tasks were taken care of in the event that the Sorcerer Supreme had died. But as you guys know, like with Peter's current situation, when this magic voicemail had played, only Ben and Felicia were there to hear it, with it asking for Peter to make his way to the Sanctum Sanctorum immediately. And when this happens, Felicia goes with Ben, and mainly because she just doesn't like the idea of him going in the place of Spider-Man to handle the affairs that Doctor Strange had requested for Peter Parker specifically. So with her going with Ben, it's not like she's being supportive or anything like that, but again, she's really just taking a lot of frustration out on Ben, because again, with Peter in this delicate condition, Ben is just swinging around as Spider-Man, and she can't stand it. But then here's another thing, because when they get to the Sanctum and Wong starts to fill him in like Doctor Strange has been murdered and we gotta figure this thing out. But then while he's saying this, classic Doctor Strange just walks by right behind him, and Felicia's just like, hold up, there you go right there. But then Wong is like, no, it's complicated. And then he realizes that this isn't actually Spider-Man, and then Ben is just like, yep, yeah, it's complicated. Which I think was a real clever play there by Jed MacKay, with not only bringing back the Ben Reilly Spider-Man Black Cat team up, but also having your stand-in Doctor Strange come across your stand-in Spider-Man. But with the way that this shakes down, Wong had given Ben a list of things that he wanted Spider-Man to take care of, which were either held up by spells that were only active when Doctor Strange was alive, which are no longer active now that he's gone, as well as threats that would just stay away before because Doctor Strange was the Sorcerer Supreme. And from there, a thing or two that Doctor Strange would just take care of, which altogether he had put on this list, which really aren't world ending in any kind of way. Like if anything at the most, New York is in danger, which is still huge because that's like 8.5 million people. But nonetheless, these tasks were handpicked for Spider-Man because Doctor Strange trusted him with these specific tasks. But as far as the situation that we're getting instead with Ben and Felicia, it's really more of a reprise to where we'd seen them team up before, when Ben had also stepped into the role of Spider-Man. But in this case, because of the emotional gravity of the situation, Felicia's taken out a lot of her fear for Peter's life on Ben by telling him that she's just tagging along because she thinks Ben wants Peter out the picture and he wouldn't want nothing more but to take Peter's place. And she lets him know that she's just coming along to watch him crash and burn. But the underlining tone of this team up, it's really a lot like what we'd seen in Spider-Man Unlimited back in the mid-90s, back when Felicia was framed for the murder of Andrea Havishall. And Ben wasn't sure or not if Felicia had did it, because for Ben, he doesn't quite know Felicia the way that Peter does. Because aside from Peter and Felicia's off and on relationship, the two of them at least had an understanding to where one, Peter would have known that Felicia's not a killer, but also if she needed help, she knew that Peter would step in and find a way to help out in whatever way he could. But also on the flip side of Ben having his suspicions about Felicia, she had hers about him too, which at the time were still the suspicions of if he's even worthy of the name Spider-Man. But even still, it was different then because Peter's life just wasn't on the line. And in fact, it was a lot more lighthearted and flirtatious. But the bottom line is at the time, it took Felicia a long time to call Ben Spider-Man. But eventually she did, and she gave him a kiss, and after that, Ben was just more confused about life in general. But with the two of them going through this list for Doctor Strange, there's about like 22 things that Doctor Strange had requested, but even still we only see like 10 of them, and even those we kind of just fly through, because for one, you had this whole ordeal with the Gator Shaman, who Doctor Strange wanted to make sure that he didn't break his treaty and just flood the streets of New York with a ton of albino gators. But with Ben skipping ahead through Doctor Strange's notes, he realizes that this treaty that Doctor Strange had with the Gator Shaman, it had also been in the best interest of preserving this endangered species, which from there convinced the shaman to honor the treaty and keep the gators safe. And after this, next on the list they had stop the hungry Prince of Hearts, because with Strange gone, he would go on the hunt again. But sadly enough, we didn't get to see much of this guy, because by the time Ben and Felicia found him, Moon Knight had already had the situation handled. And when I say handled, I mean like he caught a body, which in this case it also ties into the recent issues of Moon Knight, to where he's taken a portion of Manhattan and he's claimed it as his territory, as well as assembling his own congregation called the Midnight Mission, so that the people who need help can go to him, and if need be, he'll handle whatever problem steps into his territory, much like this fairy that caught the business in this dark alley. But from here going forward, they just kind of go on through taking care of a number of just different odd jobs, like stopping the Jiangxi in Chinatown, exercising the possessed train, stopping mummies, feeding the Central Park dragon. Like, there's a ton of things. But really the interesting part is what Felicia and Ben come to realize as they get an up close look at all these things that Doctor Strange would just take care of that nobody really knew about. And it's pretty crazy how Ben points out, like on a zoomed in level, Doctor Strange was the village doctor of New York, because every day the doctor takes care of the people, and you know that he's a good doctor because the people of the village are healthy. But it's also for that same reason that the doctor to the people of the village, like, he's invisible, because when people are healthy, they're not thinking about the doctor. No one checks on him, no one fixes the hole in his roof, like when a cosmic surfer comes falling through it. But with no one thinking about the doctor, he never really crosses their mind until they get sick, whether they just ate the wrong berries or something, and in some cases when it's just too late. And with hearing this, Felicia tells Ben, like, man, that's a nice story, who told it to you? But then Ben is just like, nobody, because Aunt May used to tell those stories to Peter, and Ben was just cloned with those memories. And with seeing this, it just reminds me of how much I've always wanted Ben to just have his own life, man. And hopefully this run of him being Spider-Man leads to that, instead of him just dying again. But then after this, with them getting to the last couple things on the list, they then take care of like some carjacking goblins, which I know sounds ridiculous, but Black Cat even told him like, hey, if you want to be Spider-Man, you got to get used to some goblins. But even still, like at this point for Ben, even with the new suit and all the features it's got in it, at this point, after everything he's been doing, even from the time when him and Peter went up against the UFOs, and even before that when he went up against Bushwhacker, but from the time that Ben had gotten this suit from the Beyond Corporation till now, he's pretty much pushed it to his limit. With them taking care of the goblins, this had then took them to the last thing on the list, which in this case wasn't any ghouls or ghosts or demons or anything crazy like that. But with this being something that was on Doctor Strange's list, Felicia points out like, well, if it's on there, it has to be important. And as it turns out, the last thing that Doctor Strange had on his list was for them to bring Jimena Garcia a pretzel at the end of her shift and just make sure she gets on the bus safely. Which really just goes to show us that to Doctor Strange that this is just as important as any other responsibility he has as the Sorcerer Supreme, because Jimena lets them know that a number of times after she's had a bad day at work, when she gets to the bus stop, Strange just happens to be walking by, who by the way she only knows as Steven. Like prior to this, she didn't know he was a doctor, she clearly didn't know that he's Sorcerer Supreme, and she definitely don't know that he's dead. Like they spared that last detail. Because when she asked about Steven and where he's at, they were just like, oh, he's out of town on business. And when Jimena asked, like, what is it that Steven actually does? And Felicia told her that Steven, he's the village doctor. But then it's after this where Ben lets Felicia know, like, the fact that we live in a world without Doctor Strange, like, that's something that we can't change. And to quote Doctor Strange, it's like living in a world with one less mystery. But he lets her know for Spider-Man, that's another story, because they can't live in a world without Spider-Man. And Ben even lets her know, like, sure, he can go back to being Scarlet Spider, but even still, that wouldn't be the same, because there has to be a Spider-Man. And with saying this, Ben even brings up Miles, saying that he may be the Spider-Man soon enough, but for the time being, Ben has got to fill those shoes, and he's got to do it as Spider-Man. And with saying this, Ben's kind of like, tell me I'm wrong. And Felicia's more or less like, yeah, okay, you were Spider-Man tonight. But she lets Ben know that she's going to get Peter out of that bed. And when she says this, like, Ben can't help but to tell her that he thought that she was more concerned with getting him into the bed. And I don't blame Ben for making that remark, because she walked right into it. But she also lets him know, like, just to be ready, because it won't be long before that happens, as far as getting Peter out of the bed. And they have the true Spider-Man back. But then she tells him, until then, see you around, Spider-Man. And I tell you, that right there just made Ben's day. Cause much like we've seen before, he gets the validation again, but this time around without the dissociative identity disorder stuff that he was going through before. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all your support. And for anyone who's new here, who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below to where you can go to patreon.com/DopeSpill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.